Greetings, dear subscribers and casual listeners of my channel. The Harry Potter universe is famous not only for its heroes, but also for its vivid, unforgettable villains. From cold-blooded manipulators to mad fanatics, each of them left a unique mark on the story. But even the darkest wizards make mistakes, and some of their decisions still leave us scratching our heads. Today we'll explore the strangest, most illogical, and downright foolish actions committed by villains in the wizarding world. Enjoy the video. Number 1. Voldemort, Theatrical Priorities. Lord Voldemort is the embodiment of evil in the magical world, but even the most powerful wizard had his oddities. The most obvious, his obsession with theatrics. When the Dark Lord returned to life in the Goblet of Fire, he staged an entire performance. Why? He could have simply killed Harry right away, but instead he delivered long speeches and basked in attention. The same happened in Order of the Phoenix and the Battle of Hogwarts. Instead of striking when he had the chance, Voldemort put on a show, almost as if making an impression mattered more than winning. Number 2, Bellatrix Lestrange, relationship with Voldemort. Bellatrix is one of Voldemort's most loyal and deranged followers, but her fanatical love for the Dark Lord crossed a line. In The Cursed Child, we learn she even had a child with him, something completely out of character for such a radical ideologue of blood purity. It's especially odd considering Voldemort was a half-blood, and Bellatrix was a married woman with deep contempt for anyone impure. Her ruthless persona took a strangely human but ultimately illogical turn. Number 3, Peter Pettigrew, hiding with the Weasleys. Pettigrew, for all his cowardice, wasn't stupid. He managed to frame Sirius Black, fake his own death, and hide as a rat. It was nearly flawless, except for one critical misstep. He chose to hide in the Weasley family, a group of Dumbledore's most loyal allies. That was practically suicide, considering their proximity to Harry, Hogwarts, and the Ministry. In the end, he was discovered thanks to the Marauders map, which he himself helped create. Number 4. Lucius Malfoy, giving Ginny the diary. Lucius is smart, calculated, and politically savvy. But in the Chamber of Secrets, he made an astoundingly foolish move. He slipped a dangerous Horcrux, Tom Riddle's diary, into Ginny Weasley's books. He wanted to stir chaos at Hogwarts, discredit Dumbledore, and purge the school of mudbloods. But the cost was too high. He risked exposing Voldemort's involvement, losing a priceless artifact, and getting caught. It felt more like a desperate gamble than a well-planned scheme. Number 5. Gilderoy Lockhart, confessing everything to Harry and Ron. Gilderoy Lockhart is a caricature, a fraud hiding behind a heroic mask, but even he could have avoided exposure if it weren't for a sudden bout of honesty. In the Chamber of Secrets, he inexplicably admitted to Harry and Ron that all his heroics were fabricated. Instead of telling another lie or simply running away, he spilled everything. A disastrous mistake for a man whose entire career was built on deception. Number 6. Quirrell, attacking Harry during the Quidditch match. Quirrell and Voldemort operated from the shadows, but at one point they decided to go bold, and they chose the worst possible moment, a Quidditch match. Hundreds of spectators, professors, Dumbledore, students, and Quirrell tries to knock Harry off his broom with a curse. Not only did the plan fail spectacularly, but Quirrell narrowly avoided exposure. The whole thing felt more like a panic attack than a tactical move. Number 7. Dolores Umbridge, firing Trelawney. Umbridge isn't your typical villain, but her cruelty and hunger for control make her one of the most hated figures in the series. Even so, she should have known that firing Trelawney wasn't the wisest decision. By doing so, she turned the faculty against her, earned the students' sympathy, and clashed head-on with Dumbledore, who stepped in immediately and prevented Trelawney's expulsion. It was a move that backfired on every level and weakened her authority. Number 8. Barty Crouch Jr., playing games with the Goblet of Fire. Barty Crouch Jr. had Harry Potter under his nose for an entire school year. Disguised as Mad-Eye Moody in the Goblet of Fire, he earned Harry's trust, manipulated his every move, and held a wand just inches away from him countless times. Yet, instead of a quiet abduction or a deadly hex in the Forbidden Forest, Barty chose the most theatrical route imaginable, rigging the Triwizard Tournament to turn the cup into a portkey. "I arranged for him to win," he confessed later. "It worked, yes, but it was like building a castle to catch a mouse. Every task, every clue, every moment was a chance for discovery." Hermione questioned it. Dumbledore noticed changes in Moody. Even Snape grew suspicious. Barty's plan depended on flawless timing and no mistakes, but the more moving parts, the higher the risk. When Harry returned from the graveyard with Cedric's body and Voldemort's name on his lips, the truth came too early. The Dark Lord's rebirth, meant to be a secret, was now exposed. Barty Crouch Jr. could have played it simple. Instead, he built a masterpiece of deception and watched it collapse in front of everyone. Number 9. Fenrir Greyback, attacking Bill Weasley. Fenrir Greyback didn't care about victory, he wanted blood. During the Battle of the Astronomy Tower in Half-Blood Prince, he lunged at Bill Weasley without warning, tearing into his face. Bill wasn't his enemy, he wasn't even in Fenrir's path. But the werewolf attacked anyway, not transformed, not even under the full moon, just because he could. "He savaged Bill," Remus said later, voice tight. "We don't know if he'll ever look the same." It was a reckless act. Bill was a respected member of the Order, the eldest of the Weasley sons, and a symbol of quiet strength. By injuring him so brutally, Fenrir did more than draw blood. He lit a fire in the hearts of those around him. Molly Weasley's grief hardened into rage. Fleur Delacour, instead of running, stood by Bill's side and declared, "I am good-looking enough for both of us." The attack backfired. It unified the defenders. It gave them purpose. Greyback could have targeted anyone. A strategic blow. A surprise. But instead he chose brutality over logic. He proved once again that he was no soldier, only a monster. Voldemort wanted fear. Fenrir delivered fury. And that fury, in the end, would cost them. Because sometimes the worst thing you can do in battle is remind your enemy what they're fighting for. Number 10, Draco Malfoy, refusing to identify Harry. Draco Malfoy stood in Malfoy Manor staring at Harry Potter's swollen, disfigured face. The Snatchers demanded he identify him. "Is it him?" his father asked, voice sharp with fear and hope. Narcissa watched silently. Draco hesitated. Too long. "I can't be sure," he said at last, but he was sure. He knew. Everyone in that room knew he knew, and still he chose silence. For years, Draco had craved recognition. Power, a place at Voldemort's side. He had sneered at Harry in corridors, boasted about the dark mark he would one day earn, and nearly killed Dumbledore under pressure. But in that moment, with the lives of Harry, Ron, and Hermione hanging by a thread, Draco faltered. It wasn't courage, it wasn't defiance, it was something messier. Doubt, fear, a crack in the armor he had worn since childhood. That choice was dangerous. If Bellatrix had seen through him, if Voldemort had been summoned and asked questions Draco couldn't dodge, it would have cost him everything. But he did it anyway. The boy who once called Hermione a mudblood now looked away when her life was on the line, not out of strategy, but out of a heart not yet fully lost. In refusing to say yes, Draco Malfoy made his first true rebellion, and no one, not even himself, fully understood or why. Number 11, Cornelius Fudge, ignoring Voldemort's return. Cornelius Fudge stood in the Hogwarts hospital wing, pale and shaking, when Dumbledore said, "Lord Voldemort has returned." But Fudge's reply was cold. "He's not back." In that moment, everything broke. Instead of believing the only man Voldemort ever feared, Fudge chose pride. He feared panic, feared losing control, feared headlines more than the Dark Lord himself. So he silenced the truth. He called Dumbledore dangerous and Harry Potter delusional. In the Order of the Phoenix, Fudge didn't just deny Voldemort's return, he made it illegal to speak of it. He installed Dolores Umbridge at Hogwarts, censored the Daily Prophet, and turned the Ministry into a machine of repression. When Harry tried to warn others, Fudge labelled him unstable. "You are spreading lies, boy," he said in front of the Wizengamot. But the lies weren't Harry's. The lies were Fudge's, repeated so often he began to believe them himself. By the time the Ministry finally admitted the truth, after the battle at the Department of Mysteries, after Sirius Black's death, after months of fear and confusion, it was too late. Voldemort was strong again, his followers were growing, and the wizarding world was fractured. Fudge's refusal to act wasn't just cowardice, it was a gift to the enemy. One man's ego let darkness rise unchecked, and the cost was measured in lives. Number 12, Severus Snape, excessive cruelty towards students. Snape sneered at Neville Longbottom like he was less than a squib. In The Prisoner of Azkaban, when Neville's boggart turned into Professor Snape, even Lupin couldn't hide his concern. "You see what he fears the most," he said quietly. It wasn't a monster. It wasn't even Voldemort. It was his teacher. That alone should have been a warning sign. Snape's relentless mockery crushed Neville's confidence. "Why do you call me Longbottom and not by my first name?" the boy once asked in private. But Snape never answered. To Harry, he was cruel beyond logic. Every lesson, every glance, a reminder of James Potter's shadow. He docked house points for imagined slights. He humiliated him in front of peers. In The Half-Blood Prince, Snape called Harry's potion utterly mediocre, even when it was perfect. The irony? It was Snape's own textbook marked, "This book is the property of the Half-Blood Prince." He sabotaged Harry emotionally, even while protecting him physically. A shield hidden behind insult after insult. Snape's mask of hatred served a purpose, but it was too convincing, too brutal. His cruelty wasn't subtle, it was public, and it raised questions not from the Death Eaters, but from the people who trusted Dumbledore. Minerva McGonagall once remarked, "Sometimes I wonder why Albus put so much faith in Severus. If McGonagall, loyal and sharp, had pushed harder, would the whole double-agent facade have crumbled?" Snape was a genius in the art of deception, but hatred is a flame that leaves smoke. It draws attention. And in a school like Hogwarts, full of curious eyes, whispering portraits, and enchanted staircases, the best place to hide isn't always in plain sight. Sometimes it's in kindness. But Snape, consumed by old grudges, never learned that part of the lesson. Number 13, Voldemort, failing to protect his Horcruxes. Voldemort feared death more than anything. He tore his soul into pieces to avoid it. And yet, the very objects that held his immortality, his Horcruxes, were treated with shocking carelessness. He handed the diary to Lucius Malfoy as if it were a cursed trinket, not a fragment of his soul. Lucius used it recklessly, pushing it into the hands of a child. The result was chaos at Hogwarts, yes, but also exposure. Dumbledore began to suspect, and once suspicion takes root, it grows fast. The Ring of Marvell-o-Gaunt, another Horcrux, was left in the ruins of the Gaunt Shack. Voldemort believed the place so cursed and forgotten that no one would ever return. But Dumbledore did, and what he found nearly killed him. "The ring carried a curse so powerful it would have killed me within minutes," he later told Snape. The irony? Voldemort's curse worked better than his hiding place. He trapped the object in magic, but failed to imagine that someone could want it for a reason other than destruction. The diadem of Rowena Ravenclaw, a priceless relic, was hidden in the Room of Requirement, the same room where generations of Hogwarts students went to hide broken furniture, love notes, and illicit bottles of fire whiskey. Tom Riddle had once found the room. He assumed no one else would, but he underestimated the very school he came from. He forgot that others knew its secrets too. "I saw it once," Luna Lovegood said, speaking of the diadem. She wasn't the only one. It was hiding in plain sight, surrounded by dust and junk. Even the locket of Salazar Slytherin, buried deep in a cave protected by magic, was stolen. Not by Dumbledore, not by the Ministry keys, but by Regulus Black, a boy Voldemort barely noticed. A house elf helped him, a creature Voldemort considered beneath him. That was the flaw. Arrogance. He believed fear was enough, that no one would dare, but they did. again and again, because in trying to become immortal, Voldemort forgot what made life fragile and what made others brave. Number 14. Gellert Grindelwald, choosing to trust Credence. Grindelwald stood at the heart of a crumbling vision. The fire of his revolution flickered, and he placed his final hope in a boy he barely knew. Credence, barebone, fragile and broken by years of abuse in the Second Salem Church, was chosen as the blade to cut through Dumbledore's protection. Grindelwald saw something in him, raw power, yes, but more importantly, a tool. He promised the boy answers, family, even a name. "You are Aurelius Dumbledore," he whispered, knowing the weight those words would carry. But Credence was no soldier. He was a storm without a compass. In Fantastic Beasts, The Crimes of Grindelwald, he shatters walls and skies with magic he cannot control, terrified by what he is becoming. "I don't know what I am," he tells Nagini in the shadows of a Parisian attic. That admission alone should have warned Grindelwald. This wasn't a partner, it was a liability. A boy drowning in trauma, clutching at illusions, not even sure if he wanted to live. Grindelwald needed precision. He needed trust, silence, control. But he gave the most critical role in his war to someone who flinched at his own reflection. When Credence unleashed his Obscurus in the streets, the damage was indiscriminate. Buildings collapsed, civilians died, and no trace of strategy remained. Grindelwald watched, silent, as the boy burned through another city, his fury unshaped. And still, he sent him to face Dumbledore, the one wizard who had already outmaneuvered him once. The choice cost him everything. Credence was never truly loyal. He was confused, desperate. In Secrets of Dumbledore, we see the final unraveling. Credence falters in the fight, weak, doubting, and eventually turns away. Grindelwald's empire crumbles not under Dumbledore's spell, but beneath the weight of his own miscalculation. He had trusted a boy he didn't understand and paid for it with his war. Number 15, Voldemort, killing Snape for the Elder Wand. Of all the blunders committed by Lord Voldemort in his quest for power, few are as richly ironic and tragically poetic as his decision to murder Severus Snape in Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows. Convinced that Snape had inherited the allegiance of the Elder Wand from Dumbledore through assassination, Voldemort, in a grotesque echo of his past misjudgments, sealed his fate by misunderstanding not only the wand's magic, but the very soul of the man he slaughtered. Snape, who had fooled the most dangerous wizard of the age with unwavering skill and pain-hardened restraint, died not because he was a threat, but because Voldemort misunderstood what loyalty truly meant, both in wand lore and in human hearts. Snape's murder was not an act of strategy. It was an act of arrogance dressed as logic. In Voldemort's mind, power must be won by force, and so the Elder Wand, the so-called Death Stick, could only change allegiance through bloodshed. He had taken the wand from Dumbledore's tomb, but it didn't yield to him. It fought him. It resisted. He sensed it in his very bones, though his ego didn't allow him to question why. To him the answer was simple. The wand belonged to the one who killed Dumbledore, and that man, he reasoned, was Snape. The logic was neat. It was also fatally flawed. J.K. Rowling writes, "I killed Snape," Voldemort told the Elder Wand, "but it has not made me its master." That line, stark and cold, reveals the precise nature of his thinking. He saw the wand as a tool, a thing to be bent to will, much like he viewed people. It never occurred to him that the wand might have a will of its own, or that magic, deep and ancient, might not adhere to the brute rules he tried to impose. The wand had chosen a new master, but it wasn't Snape, it wasn't Voldemort, it was Harry Potter. The boy who had disarmed Draco Malfoy at Malfoy Manor, unwittingly severing the chain of command Voldemort never bothered to trace. Snape died, not because he had ever wielded the wand with power or intention, but because Voldemort believed power must always follow death. The Dark Lord was blind to nuance. He saw betrayal in everything, yet missed the one truth that would have undone him sooner. Snape had never betrayed Dumbledore. Not in his heart. His loyalty had survived the unbearable. Even as he cast the curse that killed his only mentor, Snape's soul wept. It wasn't him the wand answered to, because it had never truly submitted to him. Magic knows loyalty. Magic listens to intent. There is a sharp irony in Voldemort's reliance on a wand he never truly controlled. Throughout his rise, he believed himself a master of magic, a paragon of dark power. Yet the Elder Wand, the most potent wand in existence, bucked him like a wild stallion. It sputtered in his hand, it cracked, it failed. And Voldemort, in his obsession, blamed everything but himself. Never once did he ask the most basic question, whom does the wand serve? Instead, he drew his conclusions from the carnage around him. In this, he was a man staring at the stars and seeing only his own reflection. Snape's death is perhaps one of the most senseless and symbolic in the entire series. A man who lived in layers of shadows, who committed unspeakable acts for the sake of love and remorse, died as a misunderstood cog in a larger delusion. Voldemort did not look into Snape's eyes to understand him. He saw only an obstacle, a vessel to be cracked open for power. And so, in a moment of icy murder, he unleashed Nagini, the snake bound to his soul, to tear apart the only man still tethered, however faintly, to humanity. It's hard not to see poetic justice in Voldemort's mistake. He killed Snape to gain mastery over a wand that already belonged to the boy he had spent a lifetime trying to kill. The wand did not respond to blood, it responded to defeat. When Harry wrested Draco's wand away, he unknowingly claimed the Elder Wand's allegiance, the real chain of command, subtle and hidden, passed not through killing, but through disarming, through skill, through will. Voldemort, who had always mocked Harry's compassion and underestimated his instincts, never thought to ask how power truly transfers in the world of wand lore. Dumbledore had tried to teach it in his own way. In his final confrontation with Draco, Dumbledore had arranged for his own death not to pass the wand's loyalty. He hoped Snape's mercy-killing would be a final service, a sacrifice that wouldn't alter the wand's allegiance because it was premeditated and agreed upon. Dumbledore believed this would break the chain, but the wand chose otherwise, because before Snape cast the curse, Draco had disarmed the headmaster, and that subtle act, a wand flying from one hand to another, was what counted. Harry didn't know the truth until the very end, when he pieced it together, standing over the cracked remains of a war. In the book, when he speaks to Voldemort in the Great Hall, he says, "You're right, but you're too late, because the wand's allegiance is to me." The moment is not only a revelation, it is the triumph of clarity over pride. Voldemort, whose entire rise was built on a scaffolding of fear and domination, was undone by a boy's moral compass and a wand's ancient laws. The mistake with Snape is emblematic of Voldemort's larger failures. He never understood people, not truly. He used them. He demanded allegiance, but he never earned it. With Bellatrix he had obsession, with Lucius, fear. With Snape he had a man broken by grief and guilt, a man whose allegiance lay not with power, but with promise. If Voldemort had taken a moment, just a moment, to see Snape not as a servant, but as a man, he might have sensed that Snape was not the wand's master. But Voldemort's blindness to love, to loyalty, rendered him incapable of such insight. Number 16, Crabbe, using fiend fire in the Room of Requirement. It was supposed to be a hunt, a game of cat and mouse through the labyrinthine corridors of a dying castle. The air inside Hogwarts crackled with spells, cries, and the distant rumble of crumbling stone. And while the Battle of Hogwarts waged outside, deep within the castle's twisting heart, something far more personal was happening. Harry, Ron, and Hermione, desperate to find and destroy one of Voldemort's final Horcruxes, entered the Room of Requirement. But fate, cloaked in school robes and reckless arrogance, followed close behind in the form of Draco Malfoy, Gregory Goyle, and Vincent Crabbe. This wasn't the same Vincent Crabbe the readers had known from earlier books, a dull-witted shadow who served as Malfoy's muscle. Something had changed. Maybe it was fear, maybe it was fury, or maybe it was something darker that no one saw coming. But that day, inside the shifting walls of the room of hidden things, Crabbe made a decision that would not only end his life, but nearly kill his enemies and destroy centuries of magical accumulation. He chose fire, not just any fire, but fiend fire, an uncontrollable and cursed flame capable of devouring nearly anything in its path. Crabbe, the book tells us, had lost control of the spell. The fire was now a living creature, a lava serpent, a churning, devouring beast of flames that shot toward them with the force of a hurricane. The visual is terrifying, but so is the absurdity. Crabbe, a sixth-year student, with neither the wisdom nor the discipline to wield such destructive magic, had unleashed a force that even adult Death Eaters approached with caution. This wasn't power, this was suicide. And it begs the question, what did he think would happen? The three Slytherins had cornered the trio near a towering pile of vanishing cabinets and broken broomsticks. Malfoy was shouting, Goyle was hesitating, and Crabbe, with a sudden surge of ego or lunacy, made a choice that should have spelled the end for everyone in that room. Had Harry and his friends been even a few seconds slower, they would have been incinerated. Instead, they fled the sea of flames on the back of a battered old broom. The heat was more intense than anything they had ever experienced, the narration explains, and behind them the cursed fire consumed everything, objects, history, perhaps even ghosts of the past. And Crabbe, he was gone, burned alive by his own ambition, his own fury, his own arrogance. The Room of Requirement had long been a sanctuary of secrets, a place where students hid things they shouldn't have, where old magic lingered like whispers in the stone. Over the centuries, who knows what treasures had been locked within? Rare books, forbidden artifacts, magical creatures, ancient wands, all of it lost in a matter of moments. Not to an army, not to Voldemort himself, but to a single student who wanted to win too badly and understood too little. It's easy to view Crabbe's actions as simple villainy, but the truth is more tragic. This was not strategy. It was panic wrapped in cruelty. A desperate attempt to outshine his peers, to destroy the boy who lived and perhaps, finally, to earn the respect of the Dark Lord. Crabbe was a follower all his life, and followers, when pushed into corners, sometimes reach for the most dangerous weapons, not knowing how to use them. What makes this even more grotesque is how unnecessary it all was. The trio had no wand advantage. They were outnumbered, disoriented, unfamiliar with that particular iteration of the Room of Requirement. Draco could have won, not through fire, but through fear, intimidation, and force. Instead, Crabbe introduced chaos in the middle of a war where every second counted, where Voldemort was losing fragments of his soul. One of his supposed allies destroyed the very room that could have been their salvation. What if, instead of unleashing fiend fire, Crabbe had simply used a stunning spell? What if they had taken the sword from Harry, or worse, found the diadem first? What if Voldemort had known that his Horcrux was only meters away? The butterfly effect of that fire is staggering. Crabbe's death is only the beginning. His death left Malfoy reeling. For all his arrogance, Draco had never wanted this. He had bullied and schemed, yes, but the raw destruction, the murder of a classmate by his own hand, horrified him. The same Malfoy who once sneered at Muggleborns now trembled in a room that smelled of ash and death. In that moment, he wasn't the heir of a proud pureblood family. He was a boy who had seen a friend die screaming. And Goyle, he was lucky to survive, pulled onto a broomstick by the very people they'd meant to kill. Goyle was forced to confront the cruelty and stupidity of the moment. He would not speak a word for hours after. As for Harry, the event burned itself into his memory like the mark on his forehead. The destruction of the Room of Requirement marked a turning point not just logistically but emotionally. It reminded him that the war wasn't only about grand speeches and wand duels. It was about unpredictable choices, unthinkable losses, and fires that refused to die. Rowling describes the Fiendfire with a kind of awe. Serpents, chimeras, and dragons of flame filled the room, their scales of fire shining. It's not just destruction, it's poetic horror. It's the manifestation of Crabbe's inner turmoil given form, an inferno with no target but everything in sight. Number 17. Dolores Umbridge, wearing the locket. The aftermath of the battle in the Department of Mysteries left more than broken prophecy shelves and fallen fighters. In the darkened corridors of the Ministry of Magic, something far more sinister slipped into the hands of one of its most dangerous bureaucrats. When Dolores Jane Umbridge emerged from the chaos, bruised in pride but unscathed in influence, she clung to more than her pink cardigan and tea set. She had acquired a trinket, glittering, ancient, heavy with malevolence, Salazar Slytherin's locket. But she did not know what it truly was. Or perhaps she chose not to know. Umbridge was never a witch known for introspection. She wielded authority like a weapon, not a burden. Rules were her gospel, and punishment her sermon. The very idea of magic being beyond regulation repulsed her. Yet in this twisted irony, she began to wear a piece of Voldemort's soul, unknowingly shackled to the darkest magic in existence. The locket, as readers of the Deathly Hallows know, was a Horcrux, one of several vessels into which the Dark Lord had splintered his soul. But to Umbridge, it was simply a symbol of pure blood heritage, another tool in her arsenal of fear. The locket had passed through many hands by then. Merop Gaunt had once sold it in desperation. Hepzibah Smith had once bragged about it in vain. It had ended up in the hands of a young Tom Riddle, then found its way to the cave where Creature was ordered to destroy it and failed. Eventually it passed to Mundungus Fletcher, and from there to Umbridge through some silent, back-alley transaction that bore all the hallmarks of ministry corruption. Perhaps she had purchased it. Perhaps she had confiscated it during one of her many raids against undesirables. However it came into her possession, it became part of her uniform, resting against her heart like a stone of ice. She was wearing a great big locket, Harry had observed, hidden beneath the invisibility cloak as he watched her preside over a Muggle-born registration hearing. She looks like someone who's been wearing it for a long time, and she doesn't know what it is. But the question remains, shouldn't she have known? Umbridge may not have been a student of the dark arts, but she was no fool. She understood magical artifacts, prized symbols of power, and obsessed over blood purity. The locket was engraved with a serpentine S, unmistakably belonging to Salazar Slytherin himself. It should have raised questions. Why was such an heirloom in her possession? Why did it hum with an unnatural energy, oppressive and cold? Yet she wore it, paraded it even, as a mark of authority. It gave her spine, cruelty, and confidence, but it took something else in return. There is something disturbingly poetic about Dolores Umbridge bearing a Horcrux. In the same way the locket corrupted Ron Weasley with whispers of inadequacy and jealousy, it seemed to amplify the traits already buried deep within Umbridge, her cruelty, her paranoia, her blind commitment to a twisted order. With every day it nestled beneath her blouse, her sentences grew harsher, her judgment more erratic. Witnesses to the Muggle-born Commission described her presence as unholy, suffocating, like being watched by a toad possessed. She was not simply upholding unjust laws. She was reveling in their execution. The influence of the Horcrux was slow but merciless. It did not possess its host outright, it corroded. Ron had felt it first as a whisper that made him doubt his worth beside Harry and Hermione. Hermione, too, when forced to wear it briefly, was stricken with deep despair. Yet both of them were aware of the locket's nature and fought against it. Umbridge, in contrast, embraced the sensations. She mistook the locket's darkness for strength. In her view, it reinforced her authority, justified her terrorizing of Muggleborns, and sanctified her cause. We cannot overstate the symbolism here. Umbridge, a ministry official clinging to the illusion of legal righteousness, wore an artifact created by a murderer. In many ways, she and Voldemort were reflections of each other, obsessed with purity, enamored with control, disgusted by those deemed lesser. But while Voldemort knew exactly what the locket was, Umbridge was like a child playing with fire and pretending it was a torch. This unawareness, or worse, willful ignorance, was her gravest error. It is here that we must ask, what does it mean to be evil without self-awareness? Voldemort was evil, yes, but he understood the darkness he cultivated. Umbridge, on the other hand, cloaked her malice in the banner of law. She told herself she was protecting the wizarding world, preserving purity, upholding tradition. But the moment she accepted the locket without question, she crossed an invisible threshold. She became a vessel not just of bureaucracy, but of soul-level corruption. What's most chilling is how quickly the locket seemed to nestle into her psyche. Unlike Ron, who had to be convinced to wear it, or Harry, who only wore it when necessary, Umbridge appeared unable to part with it. When Harry and Hermione broke into the Ministry under Polyjuice Potion, the locket was still clinging to her throat, and the atmosphere in the courtroom was charged with dread. The air in the courtroom seemed to crackle with tension, Rowling writes. The locket glinted in the torchlight, and Dolores Umbridge's smile was too wide, too fixed. Her need to possess it became compulsive. In hindsight, one wonders whether the locket had taken root too deeply to be removed by anyone but force. This moment, this choice, was pivotal. She could have removed the locket, she could have questioned its effects. But she did neither. Her obsession with authority dulled any suspicion. The locket didn't alarm her because its power aligned so seamlessly with her own desires. She was already cruel. Now she had an excuse to be monstrous. Number 19, Karkaroff, returning to England. When the dark mark burned, Igor Karkaroff knew what it meant. Unlike others who speculated or denied, he had no illusions. He had served Voldemort. He had whispered the Dark Lord's name in full faith, tortured enemies with pride, and pledged his soul in the name of pureblood supremacy. And yet, when the war ended, he defected. He stood before the Wizengamot, hands shaking, voice cracking, and gave names: Augustus, Rookwood, Travers, Mulciber. He saved himself from Azkaban with the last shred of self-preservation he had left. But years later, when Voldemort returned, it wasn't his betrayal that doomed him. It was what he did next. Karkaroff could have fled. He was headmaster of Durmstrang, a school far removed from the British ministry's reach, and even farther from Voldemort's initial resurgence. He had power, a respected position, and knowledge of the international wizarding community. With time, he could have disappeared into Eastern Europe, slipped into the dark corners of the Balkans or Siberia, lived among shadows where even Death Eaters would hesitate to follow. But he didn't. Instead, he returned to England. It wasn't a return in glory or in confrontation. Karkaroff didn't march into the Ministry of Magic to denounce Voldemort again. He didn't rejoin the Order of the Phoenix or beg Dumbledore for sanctuary. He crept back into the country, choosing isolation and secrecy over escape. He holed up in abandoned shacks, hidden cottages in the Highlands, or frozen ruins where only wind and owls bore witness to his fear. According to the records and accounts shared during the post-war investigations, he was seen in Derbyshire once, then in the Lake District. He was on the run from the very terror he once served, and he chose to run right into its path. This choice is nothing short of baffling. Karkaroff was no fool. He was a coward, as Sirius Black once called him, but cowardice often breeds cunning. He had survived Azkaban by giving the Ministry what they wanted. He had survived the fall of Voldemort by crawling away from the wreckage. But here, in the wake of the Dark Lord's return, that survival instinct seems to have deserted him. Why return to the lion's den when he knew that the lion remembered every wound? The most chilling aspect of this decision lies in what Karkaroff knew. He had seen the old Voldemort. He had witnessed firsthand what happened to traitors. He would have remembered Regulus Black, dead in silence. He would have heard what happened to Evan Rosier, who chose death over surrender. and he certainly would have understood that the reborn Voldemort, stronger and crueler than before, would not overlook the man who had bought his freedom by exposing the names of his loyal followers. "He ran away when the dark mark started burning," Severus Snape told Dumbledore coldly in Half-Blood Prince. "He's a coward. He won't be back." But he was back. Not to fight, not to atone, not even to beg, just to hide. And that is perhaps the most damning detail. Cowardice doesn't explain returning to England. Paranoia doesn't justify hiding in plain sight. This was a man who had lost all sense of logic, or perhaps in some cruel twist, believed he could hide in the very eye of the storm. There are hints that Karkaroff might have hoped for some kind of safety in the familiar. After the Triwizard Tournament, when Voldemort was resurrected and Cedric Diggory lay dead, Karkaroff fled Durmstrang in the middle of the night. "He disappeared before the end of the term," Dumbledore later confirmed. Perhaps England, for all its dangers, was where he thought he could watch, listen, prepare. Maybe he believed he still had contact. Old friends in Knockturn Alley, sympathizers in Yorkshire, or among the disillusioned pureblood families. He may have hoped they could shield him. But the world had changed. The Death Eaters had reassembled with a vengeance. Bellatrix Lestrange had broken free. Lucius Malfoy was rising again under the pretense of innocence. Voldemort's reach was no longer limited to backroom whispers. He had allies in the Ministry, control over the press, and a ruthless ambition to eliminate all past betrayals. Karkaroff, whose very testimony had sent Rookwood and Mulciber to prison, was high on that list. His death was inevitable. He was found months later in a shack up north, as mentioned in Half-Blood Prince. The dark mark hovered over his corpse like a sickle of doom. No one mourned him, no one investigated. The Death Eaters didn't even bother to hide their message. Traitors are not forgotten. For Voldemort, vengeance was as sacred as power, but what makes his demise truly tragic is that it wasn't unavoidable. Karkaroff had choices. Victor Krum, his former student, might have helped him leave the continent. The Durmstrang faculty might have offered protection if he had remained. And there were many countries, Brazil, Nepal, South Africa, where he could have vanished with forged papers and a different face. Even the goblins, for the right price, would have arranged his disappearance. But he chose England, a country where he was hated by the Ministry and hunted by Death Eaters, a land where no friend waited, no ally stood. Perhaps guilt played a part. He had betrayed the cause he once swore to serve, but he had also abandoned the students of Durmstrang, many of whom looked to him for leadership. Maybe he couldn't live with himself, but self-destruction doesn't always look like suicide. Sometimes it's just a refusal to run. In Karkaroff's case, that refusal was fatal. He didn't fight, he didn't plead, he simply waited. His last days must have been soaked in dread. Every sound outside his hiding place, every knock on the door, every rustling of leaves might have been the end. That kind of terror erodes the mind. And maybe that's why he made such a suicidal choice in the first place. When the fear becomes unbearable, the body seeks an end. In retrospect, Karkaroff's life was a long unraveling of compromises. He joined the Death Eaters out of ambition or fear. He betrayed them out of self-interest. He became a headmaster, not to educate, but to isolate. And finally, he returned not to face justice or to redeem himself, but simply because he had nowhere else to go. It's telling that Snape, also a former Death Eater, never tried to find him. Dumbledore never sought to offer him shelter. Even when Voldemort's power grew and every ally was precious, no one looked for Igor Karkaroff. His betrayal had been too public, his cowardice too obvious. He wasn't worth saving. And in a war defined by loyalty and sacrifice, that meant death. Voldemort was a master of manipulation, but he was also a creature of wrath. His enemies feared his spells, but his followers feared his judgment. Karkaroff had broken the one rule that Voldemort never forgave, betrayal. He had been a rat in a cage, waiting for the snake to return. And when the snake came, it struck with fangs bared. In the end, Karkaroff's story is a lesson in the futility of half measures. He didn't fully join the resistance, nor did he completely return to the fold. He lived in limbo, a ghost of two worlds, trusted by neither. And in the wizarding world, neutrality is not an option. You either stand and fight, or run far enough that they forget your name. Karkaroff did neither. The wizarding world is full of grey characters, people like Snape, who defied expectations, or Regulus Black, who died for redemption. But Karkaroff is not among them. His actions were not noble. His regrets were not powerful enough to inspire change. He is a tragic figure, but not a sympathetic one. His death serves not as a sacrifice, but as a warning. Igor Karkaroff's body was found in a shack, the report said, brief and cold. But behind that line lies 1,000 questions. Could he have lived? Could he have changed? Could he have mattered? The answer, most likely, is no, because the moment he decided to return to England, to the heart of the war he once helped ignite, he sealed his fate. It wasn't bravery. It wasn't redemption. It was a final, fatal miscalculation by a man who thought he could outwait a storm. Number 20. Augustus Rookwood, leaking information to the Ministry. In the shadowy corridors of the Ministry of Magic, where memos fly like birds and secrets slip through cracks no spell can seal, Augustus Rookwood walked with the confidence of a man who belonged. His dark robes blended in with the dull browns and greens of the Department of Mysteries, and his name carried just enough weight to avoid suspicion, but not enough to draw undue attention. He was not flamboyant like Lucius Malfoy, nor was he feared like Bellatrix Lestrange. He was subtle, patient, meticulous, a true bureaucrat, and for Lord Voldemort, the perfect spy. For years, Rookwood operated under a veil of careful neutrality. While Death Eaters waged war in the open, Rookwood stayed within the machinery of the Ministry. His value was in access, not destruction. He wasn't a soldier, he was an observer. He read confidential memos, attended high-level meetings, and stored every whispered directive in a mind trained to remember and deliver. In the early days of the First Wizarding War, Rookwood's information proved invaluable. He leaked oral patrol schedules, strategic plans, and even hints about who within the Ministry might be turned. He was the quiet wind behind several disasters. But somewhere along the way, the subtlety vanished. There is something dangerously intoxicating about power that is not challenged. Rookwood's early successes were quiet victories, shared in dark rooms with men who praised him not for his strength, but for his usefulness. Voldemort valued information above loyalty, and Rookwood delivered. Yet in this praise, something shifted in the man. The once careful agent began to believe himself invincible. He saw his position not just as a channel, but as a shield. After all, who would question the unspeakable? The turning point, many historians agree, came shortly before the betrayal of the Longbottoms. Rookwood had begun taking greater risks, passing messages to known Death Eaters not through intermediaries, but directly. He was seen speaking to Travers, exchanging briefcases in broad daylight at the edge of Nocturne Alley. When questioned, he claimed departmental collaboration, and the Ministry, tangled in bureaucracy and hubris, believed him. Why wouldn't they? Rookwood had been loyal. He had years of service. His father had worked for the Wizengamot. He was safe. It was Barty Crouch Sr. who first raised doubts. Crouch, a man of fanatical order and rigid justice, had been burned too many times. He recognized the signs. Sudden changes in office behavior, security breaches that pointed too cleanly to junior staff, memos disappearing and reappearing as if guided by invisible hands. But he lacked proof. And in the Ministry, accusations without evidence were more dangerous than the threats they hinted at. Still he watched. Rookwood's fatal flaw was not his allegiance to Voldemort. It was his growing belief that he was beyond consequence. Like many Death Eaters who operated from within, he misunderstood the line between fear and control. The more he gave to Voldemort, the more he sought to impress him. It became a competition, a dangerous game of who could provide the most valuable intelligence the fastest. In trying to win the Dark Lord's favor, Rookwood lost his edge. In the pensive memories shared during the trials after the First Wizarding War, one moment stands out. Igor Karkaroff, facing a possible lifetime sentence in Azkaban, whispered, "Rookwood, Augustus Rookwood, he gave information from inside the ministry. He's one of yours." This revelation, simple and cold, was like a crack of thunder in the courtroom. The name hit the air with a weight it had never carried before, and everything changed. Crouch's suspicions solidified, warrants were issued, offices were searched, and the man who had walked unseen among the ranks of the ministry found himself dragged into the cold, suffocating walls of Azkaban. Rookwood was convicted of passing ministry secrets to he who must not be named, and received a life sentence in Azkaban, Order of the Phoenix, Chapter 25. The record stands, but the story behind it remains a cautionary tale of arrogance. Unlike other Death Eaters who were swept into fanaticism, Rookwood's betrayal was not born of belief, but of ambition. He wasn't driven by ideology. He didn't speak of bloodlines or purity. He spoke of opportunity, of advantage. In this way, he was not the stereotypical villain. He was worse, a man who betrayed for gain without conviction. His colleagues were stunned. One of the unspeakables, a man entrusted with the Department of Mysteries, the most secure branch of the ministry, the same man who had helped draft protocols for the handling of the Hall of Prophecy, the same man who had quietly lobbied for increased surveillance, not of enemies, but of internal staff. He was part of the system, and he had corrupted it from within. Rookwood's arrest was not theatrical, no grand duel in the halls of power, no chase through Diagon Alley. It was quiet, procedural, almost pathetic. He was led away from his desk, still holding a quill, ink still wet on a parchment that would never be read. His wand was taken. His eyes, they say, did not show fear, only disbelief. As if the system he had outwitted had suddenly betrayed him. But it hadn't. It had simply noticed. The irony of Rookwood's fall lies in his method. He did not err by leaking information. He erred by leaking too much, too often, too obviously. Where once he had used discretion and delay, he began moving faster than the cover could support. His messages became longer, his methods sloppier, and he drew attention not just from the ministry but from within the Death Eater ranks. There were whispers that even Voldemort grew wary, that Rookwood's eagerness was unbecoming. This, perhaps, is the cruelest twist, that in his final months Rookwood was not just distrusted by the ministry, but by Voldemort himself. In trying to serve both, he pleased neither. To the Death Eaters he was a liability, to the ministry a traitor. When Azkaban's gates closed behind him, no one mourned. He was simply forgotten. During the Second Wizarding War, Voldemort freed Rookwood from Azkaban alongside others, but by then the world had changed. Rookwood was no longer the confident insider. He was a relic, an echo of a more naive time. Though he fought again under the Dark Mark, he never regained his influence. He was captured during the Battle of Hogwarts and bound for justice once more. Yet even in this, he was overshadowed. History had passed him by. When students learn of the First War, they study the rise and fall of major figures, Voldemort, Dumbledore, the Potters, and Snape. Rookwood is a footnote, a name on a list. But to those who study betrayal, espionage, and the weaknesses of systems, his story is essential. He was proof that sometimes the most dangerous enemies are not the ones who storm the gates, but the ones who walk through them with keys. His office, long since sealed and repurposed, was said to contain records of messages encoded in symbols no one could fully decipher. Some believe Rookwood left a final secret, buried in the bureaucratic mess he once mastered. Others think there's nothing left to find, that all he had to offer died with his relevance. Either way, his legacy is caution, not power. The ministry has since installed new protocols. The Department of Mysteries now rotates staff more frequently. Access logs are enchanted to detect falsification. Information is compartmentalized. Rookwood's betrayal taught them what no spell ever could. Trust, once given, must never be blind. And yet there are still murmurs. Some believe Rookwood, even in Azkaban, managed to pass one last message, that he was never fully caught, that a second layer of deception existed deeper than even Crouch suspected. If true, it would mean that Rookwood, for all his arrogance, remained a player until the end. But the truth remains elusive. As of the latest ministry records, Rookwood is presumed dead. No public funeral, no grave marked. His name lives only in files and whispered warnings to young aurors. Beware the quiet ones, they're often the most dangerous. And so the story of Augustus Rookwood settles not in triumph, but in lesson. His fall was not sudden, but slow erosion, a man consumed by the belief that he was too clever to fall, that his mind, honed in secrets, would shield him forever. He was wrong, his mind betrayed him, and the world watching silently never forgot. Number 21, Tom Riddle, killing Hepzibah Smith. The room smelled of roses and antique velvet, the air thick with sweetness and secrets. Hepzibah Smith, swathed in lace and wrapped in self-importance, sat perched like an aging queen in her gilded throne of a chair, unaware that she was already history. The day she invited young Tom Riddle into her home was the day her name was added to a different kind of ledger, one Voldemort would never share with the world, but would carry forever in the shadow of his soul. It was the day Tom made what some might call his first critical mistake, cloaked as ambition, poisoned with impatience. By all accounts, Hepzibah Smith was precisely the kind of person who drew the eye of an aspiring Dark Lord. Wealthy, vain, and foolishly trusting, she was more enamored with admiration than with discretion. Her house elf, Hoki, served her faithfully, but had neither the cunning nor the strength to protect her from the storm that approached in the shape of a young man with flawless manners and a venomous heart. When Hepzibah unveiled her most prized possessions, Helga Hufflepuff's cup and Salazar Slytherin's locket, Tom's path became clear. But in that moment of clarity, he made a mistake that would leave an indelible mark on the path of the Dark Lord's rise. The murder of Hepzibah Smith, committed when Tom was barely out of Hogwarts, was not just a crime, it was a tactical blunder. He was a model student, Dumbledore once said, but I never liked the look in his eyes. Tom had worked hard to craft a perfect mask, to move through society undetected, to build connections and a reputation that would eventually give him power. But the murder of Hepzibah shattered that mask in a small but vital way. Her sudden death raised eyebrows in more than one place, and while the official cause was chalked up to a mishap involving her house elf, the truth was far more sinister. What made Tom's decision so questionable wasn't the act of murder itself. He had killed before. It was the choice of victim, timing, and the clumsy method of execution. He was still young, lacking the subtlety he would later master. Hepzibah was well known in wizarding social circles, and she boasted about her treasures with the giddy recklessness of someone who believed they were untouchable. Killing her brought immediate suspicion. The goblins at Gringotts were likely aware of the transfer of the cup from their vaults. Her relatives, though estranged, would have demanded answers. Dumbledore, who had already begun to collect whispers of Riddle's dark inclinations, undoubtedly took notice of this sudden and convenient demise. Had Tom waited, the treasures might have come to him through inheritance, manipulation, or simple theft. But impatience, that telltale scar of youth, drove him to violence. He killed Hepzibah not because he had to, but because he could. In doing so, he laid down one of his first Horcruxes, Hufflepuff's cup, through an act that felt more personal than calculated. The cup would be hidden in Bellatrix Lestrange's vault years later, a symbol of power born in blood, but the price of that blood was the beginning of his exposure. J.K. Rowling gives us a chilling view of this moment through the pensive, when Harry watches Tom charm the older woman with ease. "You see," Hepzibah giggles, "you remind me of someone. My darling little Zacharias, who was ever so handsome, and you do know how to flatter a lady." It was this exact blend of arrogance and infatuation that made her vulnerable. Tom didn't need to push hard. Her need to be admired did the work for him. But that was the flaw. She was too vocal, too public, and her death too sudden. The murder was pinned on Hoki, the house elf, who allegedly added the wrong ingredient to her mistress's cocoa. Tom manipulated the scene, erased his traces, and disappeared from the narrative, but not from Dumbledore's watchful eye. The headmaster, though lacking concrete proof, began to understand the pattern. People close to Riddle disappeared, his family, his father, and now a wealthy witch who happened to own 2 priceless relics. The web was spinning, and Tom had left a strand dangling. More than that, the murder revealed something more troubling: Tom's capacity for unnecessary cruelty. In a calculated act of dark magic, he had sealed part of his soul into the Hufflepuff cup. But was the murder of Hepzibah really worthy of a Horcrux? She posed no threat. There was no dramatic battle, no legendary duel. It was an act of convenience, not grandeur. And yet Tom used it. He needed the artifact more than he needed a spotless record. This speaks volumes of his obsession. He valued the symbol over the strategy. He killed because the cup mattered more than the consequences. It's worth noting that Tom had access to many ancient artifacts during his time at Borgin and Burke's. He could have waited, manipulated and deceived his way to ownership, but chose the loudest path. Hepzibah's murder became a spotlight on his shadow. The consequences echoed far beyond her mansion. The memory, stored in the mind of Hokey and later retrieved by Dumbledore, added another piece to the puzzle that would later be used against Voldemort. This moment also shows how even the most brilliant can make fatal errors in youth. Tom was, without question, a prodigy. He had charmed everyone at Hogwarts, including Slughorn, who would later recall, with shame, how he told the boy about Horcruxes. "I wouldn't tell you anything like that if I thought you were going to go off and do it," he had cried. But Tom already had. His intellect betrayed him because it lacked wisdom. He had knowledge, but not foresight, confidence without restraint. Had he taken the longer road, continued to build trust, gathered power silently, he might have ascended without the suspicion that began to follow him. Hepzibah's death caused a tremor, small but sharp, in the foundation of his public image. It was not yet Voldemort who killed her. It was still Tom Riddle, a handsome young man with ambition in his eyes. That name would soon vanish, replaced by a title. But the act remained in the ledger. Years later, when Harry and Dumbledore uncovered the truth, the significance of this moment crystallized. He was arrogant, Dumbledore said. He liked to collect trophies. He liked to possess beautiful things. He saw them as extensions of himself. Hepzibah Smith's cup was not merely a relic, it was a mirror. In it, Tom saw not Helga Hufflepuff's legacy, but his own future greatness, stolen and repurposed. But the theft cost him more than he realized. The irony is sharp. In killing Hepzibah, Tom believed he was ascending. In truth, he was planting the seeds of his fall. Dumbledore's attention shifted from curiosity to certainty. The pattern became too distinct to ignore. By the time Tom returned to Hogwarts to ask for the defense against the dark arts position, Dumbledore had made his decision. He refused him, not only to keep him from influence, but because he knew the truth. He had seen the darkness behind the mask. What followed was a long chain of hide and seek, where Tom, now Voldemort, buried his Horcruxes like bones in the earth, each one more grotesque and hidden than the last. But the cup was the beginning of that pattern, and its creation was born in recklessness. In some sense, it is the most tragic of his artifacts, not because of what it became, but because of what it revealed. Hepzibah Smith was not a warrior, she was not a threat, she was a woman in love with her past and her possessions who trusted the wrong young man. Her death did not shake the world, but it did shake a door open. Dumbledore began to watch more closely. The Ministry began to record his name, and somewhere, perhaps even unknowingly, Tom Riddle crossed a line he could not uncross. The illusion of control was gone. In murdering her, Tom showed that he wasn't yet the master manipulator he believed himself to be. He still needed practice, still confused charm with strategy, violence with inevitability. In some ways, it was this very act that proved he was human, after all. Not yet a legend, just a dangerous boy pretending to be a god. And so the irony persists. The murder that gave birth to one of his Horcruxes also birthed suspicion, records, and questions that would lead to his undoing. What he considered an act of pure control revealed a critical flaw. His hunger overruled his cunning. His pride blinded him to consequences. In the end, the cup would be found, destroyed by Hermione in the Chamber of Secrets. A relic desecrated, a soul fragment shattered, and with it, a piece of the past, a memory of a decision made in haste, a death that could have been avoided, and a moment when Tom Riddle's path to immortality began with a stumble, not a step. Would he have succeeded had he waited? Perhaps. But Voldemort never waited. He consumed, and in his hunger he made mistakes. Hepzibah Smith was one of them. Number 22, Nagini, interfering in the Battle of Hogwarts. It was the night the castle roared. The stones of Hogwarts trembled with fire and fury, spells sliced the air like knives, and centuries-old walls stood witness to the final reckoning of a war, decades in the making. Among the swirling chaos of the Battle of Hogwarts, one presence slithered with quiet, unsettling grace through the shadows, a presence far more consequential than any casual observer might have realized. Nagini, the great serpent of Lord Voldemort, watched the chaos through lidless eyes, her body encased in a magical sphere of protection. She was there, at the heart of it all. But the question remains, why? For all his calculated cruelty, Voldemort was a creature of deep strategy. His moves were often shrouded in secrecy, his motives buried under layers of deception. He concealed Horcruxes across the wizarding world, in a vault at Gringotts, in the ruins of Gaunt's shack, within the very walls of Hogwarts itself. He guarded each fragment of his soul with traps, riddles, enchantments. And yet, with Nagini, arguably the most accessible and vulnerable of all his Horcruxes, he made a decision that defied all logic. He brought her with him into battle, into chaos, into death. The choice to keep Nagini at his side during the Battle of Hogwarts is one of the most baffling decisions Voldemort ever made. This serpent was not merely a pet. She was, by the end, a living vault for his soul, the final Horcrux he consciously created. "You are very near the end of your path," Dumbledore had told Harry, and he was right. Voldemort had come to trust Nagini above all others, but trust was not the same as invulnerability. Encased though she was in the protective charm of the floating magical sphere, she remained physically close to him, an echo of arrogance, a whisper of overconfidence. Her presence wasn't just proximity, it was participation. She wasn't hidden away in the safety of the forbidden forest, or left coiled in the secret corners of the shrieking shack. No, Voldemort kept her within reach, within the danger. Why? Some might argue it was a reflection of his paranoia. By this point in the war, he had come to suspect betrayal from nearly every corner, his Death Eaters, the Carrows, even Lucius Malfoy. In Nagini, he found comfort. She was obedient, silent, and wholly his. She could not lie, could not defect, but she could die. The most haunting proof of this comes not in whispers, but in action. When Voldemort withdrew into the shrieking shack to await Harry's inevitable appearance, Nagini was there. Rowling writes, and he had that snake, Nagini, the snake he was making, guard the boy. Guard, yes, but also expose. In the madness of Voldemort's unraveling mind, perhaps the line between protector and prisoner blurred. To him, to keep something close was to control it. But control is not the same as concealment, and concealment was exactly what he should have chosen. Dumbledore understood this instinct better than anyone. The old headmaster, who sacrificed so much to understand Voldemort's magic, would never have allowed a Horcrux to breathe in the open. He set them apart behind riddles and flames and curses, because he knew the true weight of soul-splitting, the care it demanded. But Voldemort, he grew careless, and perhaps desperate. As the war reached its boiling point, Voldemort's emotional grip on the world began to loosen, his rage grew, his cruelty sharpened, but his judgment, it faltered. The same man who had once hidden a locket in the belly of an inferi-infested cave now kept a Horcrux slithering at his feet like a common hound. The difference was not in intelligence, but in fear. Nagini was no longer simply an object of his immortality. She had become his confidant, his crutch. He needed her close because he feared losing everything else. This dependency reached a crescendo in the shrieking shack when he used her as the executioner of Severus Snape. Not with a spell, not with the killing curse, but with Nagini's fangs. A visceral death, a personal one. And yet, even in that moment of twisted symbolism, he failed to understand what he had exposed. Snape's murder, carried out by a Horcrux, was a recklessly poetic act, one that drew eyes toward the serpent, even as Voldemort hoped it would go unnoticed. And indeed, it did not go unnoticed. Harry, Ron, and Hermione, already on the path to destroy each Horcrux, saw Nagini. They understood. The magical protections around her did not erase her identity. They broadcast it. The glowing, hovering prison was no disguise. It was a beacon. "It's the snake," Harry says. "She's the last one. She has to be destroyed." From that moment, a target was drawn, not just by the trio, but by fate itself. It is critical to understand that Voldemort had alternatives. He could have left Nagini in the care of Bellatrix in the dungeons of Malfoy Manor, or sealed her away with enchantments in Nurmengard, alongside the ruins of Grindelwald's final days. Instead, he dragged her into fire and fury, into the grasp of a boy who had already severed so many pieces of his soul. Why? Perhaps he believed himself invincible. Perhaps he believed Nagini invincible. Either way, he miscalculated. Even more ironically, it was not Harry who delivered the killing blow. It was Neville Longbottom, a young man who had suffered quietly in the background for years, whose parents had been shattered by Bellatrix's wand, a boy Voldemort had once dismissed as irrelevant. And yet, when Voldemort summoned the sorting hat, jammed it onto Neville's head, and set it ablaze, he lit the fuse of his own demise. For in that fire, Neville drew Gryffindor's sword, and in a single, sweeping moment of destiny, he cleaved the serpent in two. Rowling writes, "The slash of the blade was sudden and clean. The snake's body thudded to the floor." And with that sound, a part of Voldemort screamed, not aloud, not visibly, but the tear in his soul deepened. Nagini was dead, the final Horcrux destroyed, and the Dark Lord who believed himself immortal became mortal once more. What made this moment even more tragic for Voldemort was that it was avoidable. He had protected Nagini with powerful magic. Why not shield her more thoroughly by removing her from the battlefield altogether? By keeping her at his side, he ensured her destruction. The battlefield was not the place for a Horcrux. It was a place of wild spells, flying curses, uncontrolled chaos. And yet he planted his soul in its center. There's also the matter of Voldemort's reliance on intimidation. He wanted his enemies to see Nagini and fear her. She was a symbol of his power. She had killed, she had spoken, she had devoured the bodies of the dead. To him, she was not only protection, she was propaganda. The message was clear: I do not fear you, I do not need to hide. But the cost of that arrogance was unthinkable. Arrogance has long been Voldemort's fatal flaw. It cost him the Elder Wand, whose allegiance he never truly owned. It cost him the loyalty of his followers, who crumbled when the tide turned. And in the end, it cost him Nagini, his last remaining tether to life beyond death. Her loss did not merely unmake a piece of his soul, it stripped him of his illusion of control. It's worth noting that Voldemort did not even react properly to her death. He did not mourn her, he did not rage. He was too far gone. By then, he was spiraling, reduced to a shell of fury and desperation. The boy who feared death had become the man who courted it. He raised his wand not with strategy but with spite. The end, as always, was fitting. When the killing curse rebounded once more upon him, when Voldemort finally fell, his body crumbling like ash, it was not because of some singular act of heroism, it was because his choices had finally caught up with him. and among the most fatal of those choices was Nagini. The serpent he loved, the Horcrux he paraded, the weakness he never admitted. In this way, Nagini's death was not only symbolic, it was narrative justice. The serpent, ancient emblem of cunning, secrecy, and danger, became the chink in his armor. Voldemort thought her his strength, but she was his ruin. Even now, rereading the final pages of the Deathly Hallows, one cannot help but feel the tragedy of it. Not sympathy for Voldemort, but for the twisted logic that brought him to ruin. A man who divided his soul 7 times, only to let its last vessel slither at his feet like a crown jewel, ready to be taken, ready to be killed. And so the Battle of Hogwarts claimed its victims, heroes and villains alike. But among the decisions that shaped its outcome, none were so self-destructive, so needlessly reckless, as Voldemort's choice to bring Nagini into the heart of war. The act of a genius blinded by hubris, the final mistake of a man who thought himself a god, number 23, Bartemius Crouch, Sr., sending his son to Azkaban. He was not a man who bent, not to public opinion, not to family, and certainly not to mercy. Bartemius Crouch Sr. stood tall in the corridors of the Ministry of Magic like a monument to order. His robes were always pressed, his gaze always sharp, and his judgments always swift. Yet in the legacy of war, where the lines between hero and villain often blur, Crouch's unyielding pursuit of justice became his greatest flaw. For in choosing law over love, he condemned not only his son, but perhaps the very future he once sought to protect. When the First Wizarding War reached its blood-drenched peak, the wizarding world had no time for half measures. The Ministry, under siege by Voldemort's Death Eaters, needed faces of resolve, men who would promise the people safety in exchange for absolute obedience. Bartemius Crouch Sr. rose quickly to this call. As head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, he crafted an iron image of himself, uncompromising, incorruptible, and utterly committed to rooting out every last trace of the Dark Lord's influence. The public called him a hero, but to those who saw past the headlines, he was becoming something colder, an agent of fear, not hope. It was during this crucible of paranoia that the name Bartemius Crouch Jr. first trembled through courtroom walls. A mere boy in comparison to the grizzled soldiers and killers he was chained beside, young Barty's face was pale and pleading, his eyes wide with disbelief. He had been caught in the company of known Death Eaters, Bellatrix Lestrange, Rodolphus Lestrange, and Rabastan Lestrange, after the vicious torture of Frank and Alice Longbottom, 2 beloved Aurors who were driven into madness by the Cruciatus curse. The crime was unforgivable, but the evidence against Barty Jr., as later accounts suggested, was fragile at best. Still, it was not a courtroom that decided his fate. It was his father. In Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire, Sirius Black recalls the event to Harry, describing Crouch's relentless rise and fall. Crouch's own son was caught with a group of Death Eaters who were torturing Frank and Alice Longbottom. Crouch went straight for the conviction, sent his own son to Azkaban. The memory of that moment became legend in Ministry corridors, a father who would sacrifice his only child to maintain the illusion of justice, a man who proved that no one, not even blood, was above the law. But that decision was not born of justice, it was born of fear. Crouch Sr.'s career was already under siege. The war was spiraling. Accusations of Death Eater sympathies floated in the shadows. Whispers accused him of being too ambitious, too cold, too swift in his judgments. He had begun using Dementors in trials, eliminating the need for juries and proper defense. People disappeared on suspicions alone. His face hardened with each decree. He believed in the rule of law, but more dangerously, he believed in the illusion of control. So when his son was brought before him, he didn't see a boy. He saw a threat to his reputation, to his authority, to the order he had sacrificed everything to maintain. So he made a choice. He sent Barty Jr. to Azkaban forever. No trial, no investigation into the boy's version of events, no plea for clemency. The boy's mother wept openly in the courtroom. His father did not blink. Years later, Dumbledore would refer to this as a terrible thing and suggest that Crouch Sr. acted out of misplaced priorities. It was not only the cruelty of the sentence that shook the wizarding world, it was the lack of humanity in it. Other Death Eaters were spared worse. Severus Snape, for example, was given sanctuary by Dumbledore's testimony. Igor Karkaroff bargained for his freedom by naming names, but Barty Jr. had no defense, no protector, only the cold, mechanical wrath of his father's ambition. Yet the story did not end there. Madame Crouch, dying from a wasting illness, begged her husband for one final act of kindness. Her wish was to see her son freed, even if only to save him from a slow death in Azkaban. And so Crouch Sr., for once bending to emotion, executed a secret, illegal switch using Polyjuice Potion. His wife died in her son's place, buried under a false name, her death registered as Barty Jr.'s. It was an act of desperation and guilt, but not of redemption. What followed was a dark descent. Crouch Sr. confined his son under the Imperious Curse, keeping him hidden in the family home with the house elf, Winky, as his jailer. A prison of guilt replacing the one built of stone. But nothing rots the soul like forced obedience. In the shadows of the manor, Barty Jr.'s hatred festered. He no longer merely idolized Voldemort, he worshipped him. In his mind, his father had destroyed his life to protect his own face. He was betrayed not only by the world, but by the man who had been his hero. And in that betrayal, Voldemort's ideology took root. The cruelty of the father became the justification of the son's fanaticism. Years later, when Voldemort returned in secret, it was Barty Jr. who welcomed him first. Loyal, obedient, and hungry for vengeance, he helped orchestrate the plan to sabotage the Tri-Wizard tournament and ensure Harry Potter's death. Using Polyjuice Potion and the kidnapped body of Alastor Moody, Barty infiltrated Hogwarts itself. He manipulated events, deceived Dumbledore, and nearly killed the boy who lived. In one of the darkest ironies of the saga, the very thing Crouch Sr. feared, shame, returned in the most horrifying form. His son, now a true Death Eater, stood at the heart of Voldemort's return. Worse yet, it was the father's own judgment that had built the foundation of his transformation. If Bartemius Crouch Sr. had paused, just once, to see his son, not as a potential scandal, but as a scared, corrupted young man, things might have changed. If he had used his considerable power not for control but for compassion, the name Crouch might have stood for something more than fear. If he had allowed justice to be tempered by mercy, Barty Jr. might never have become a monster, but he did not. And so, in a cruel twist of fate, Crouch Sr. died at the hands of the very boy he condemned. Hidden under an imperious curse, his mind shattered, he became a prisoner in his own home. When he finally escaped to warn Dumbledore, he was barely coherent, and before he could say the full truth, his son, now the false Moody, silenced him forever. He was buried with little fanfare, his name erased from headlines, his legacy quietly removed from ministry lore. It is tempting to paint Bartemius Crouch Sr. as a villain. His rigidity, his abuse of legal authority, his cold dismissal of his son's life, they are unforgivable. But the true tragedy is that he was not evil. He was, instead, a good man who let fear rule his heart. He became so obsessed with the idea of order that he lost all connection to what made the law worth defending, humanity. The story of the Crouch family stands as a haunting lesson. Voldemort's greatest weapon was never just magic, it was division. He thrived in broken homes, shattered loyalties, and twisted ideologies. He offered purpose where love had failed, and in the House of Crouch he found a soldier ready to be forged. To this day, the memory of Crouch Sr.'s courtroom moment echoes. It is a moment that lives not in law books, but in warnings. The wizarding world remembers him not as a villain, but as a cautionary tale, a man who did everything right, on parchment, and yet lost everything that mattered. As Albus Dumbledore once said, "It is our choices, Harry, that show what we truly are far more than our abilities." Crouch Sr. chose the law, chose power, chose pride. And in doing so, he lost the chance to make a better choice for his son, for himself, and for the world. Perhaps had he listened to his heart, the Second War might never have begun. Or perhaps in sparing his son, he would have lost something else. We'll never know, but what remains is chilling. In trying to destroy a Death Eater, Crouch Sr. helped create one. And that may be the most tragic villainy of all. Number 24, Death Eaters, theatrics in their infiltration of Hogwarts. In the darkness of the Astronomy Tower, a choice was made that would shape the course of the Wizarding War, not merely in the physical sense of who lived or died, but in the realm of public image, morale, and strategic competence. The Death Eaters, having finally breached the impenetrable fortress of Hogwarts, had a golden opportunity to deliver a silent, surgical strike that would shatter the resistance. But instead they chose theatre over tactics, and that mistake, cloaked in the form of a grand, fearsome spectacle, proved to be a miscalculation with lasting consequences. It was Draco Malfoy, trembling and pale with the weight of an impossible mission, who managed what no servant of Voldemort had accomplished in years. He opened Hogwarts from the inside. Using the vanishing cabinet in the Room of Requirement, he created a portal for Death Eaters to infiltrate the school. The act was ingenious, even brilliant in its ambition. The cabinet, long forgotten and broken, was repaired under the noses of the faculty. No alarms were tripped, no teachers suspected. Not even Dumbledore seemed fully aware of Draco's success until it was too late. The operation had all the markings of a masterstroke. But then came the folly. Instead of striking fast and disappearing into the night, the Death Eaters paraded through the castle like conquerors through a burning city. Fenrir Greyback, half wild with the stench of blood in his nose, snarled at students and left claw marks on the walls. Alecto and Amicus Carrow cursed portraits and terrorized anyone they passed. They lit chaos like torches in the corridors, shaking the illusion of Hogwarts' safety, but also alerting every inhabitant to their presence. Their goal, Dumbledore's assassination, was achievable within moments of arrival, but they waited, they hesitated, they staged, and in that space of hesitation, the tide began to turn. When Severus Snape ascended the tower and delivered the fatal curse, it was already too late to vanish cleanly. "Avada Kedavra!" he cast, and Dumbledore fell, his body arcing in a tragic silhouette against the night sky. But the green flash was not the end of the tale. It was only the beginning of the consequences. Snape, the Order's most valuable double agent, was forced to flee, his cover irreparably blown. The Death Eater's entrance through the vanishing cabinet had revealed a secret that would be sealed forever afterward. Hogwarts' ancient protections had proven penetrable and, worse, vulnerable to student manipulation. The attack sparked a wave of fear, but also determination. A new resistance was born that night in the hearts of the students who watched it unfold. The question lingers in every rereading of the Half-Blood Prince. Why didn't they act with greater efficiency? Why the display? Why the noise? From a tactical perspective, their actions lacked discipline. Bellatrix Lestrange, the most loyal of Voldemort's soldiers, led with madness rather than strategy. Her glee in destruction blinded her to the objective. As she set fire to Hagrid's hut and sent hexes in every direction, she ensured that every professor and ghost in the castle would become alert. Her delight in violence became a liability. The attack became performance art, loud, messy, and ultimately unsustainable. In choosing the theatrical approach, the Death Eaters also underestimated their audience. The students, many of whom had lost loved ones in the First War, did not cower. Instead, they rallied. In the following year, members of Dumbledore's army would organize underground movements. Neville Longbottom, emboldened by the tragedy, became a leader. "People die every day," he would later say. "Friends, family. Yeah, we still lost Harry's parents, but they didn't die in vain." Had Dumbledore been killed quietly, perhaps with poisoned wine in his office, the morale of the Order might have crumbled. A sudden, mysterious death would have shaken the foundation of the movement. The absence of drama would have bred paranoia rather than rage. Instead, the vivid imagery of his fall galvanized the school. The quiet grief was replaced by a fiery resolve. Even Voldemort, the orchestrator of fear, seemed to have misjudged the effect of spectacle. In earlier moves, his approach had been surgical: targeted killings, disappearances, the creation of terror through silence. But in this case, he allowed a degree of freedom to his followers, and that freedom birthed recklessness. As a result, he lost his most strategically placed agent. Snape's escape, though successful, came at the cost of decades of positioning. "You have used me," he once accused Dumbledore, but it was the Dark Lord who had squandered the greatest resource by forcing Snape into the open. The spy who had served both sides was now severed from both. The Death Eaters celebrated, but they had unwittingly cut the rope bridge behind them. And yet the school remained standing. Shaken? Yes. Mournful? Certainly. But it did not fall. The tactic of fear works best when it's clean. A cold, efficient assassination creates doubt, not defiance. Instead, the Death Eaters' intrusion reminded everyone at Hogwarts that evil could be fought, that it was fallible. The deaths of James and Lily Potter had been quiet, private, and their memory lived on in whispers. But Dumbledore's death, witnessed and shared, became a rallying cry. Ironically, it was Draco who had come closest to succeeding in silence. As he stood on the tower, wand trembling, Dumbledore spoke to him not as an enemy, but as a child who had lost his way. "You are not a killer, Draco," he said softly. And he was right. Draco was not ready for the bloodshed. And in that hesitation we glimpse the final flaw in Voldemort's plan. He placed the key to his mission in the hands of a boy who didn't want it. The Death Eaters' error was not just one of execution, it was philosophical. They failed to understand the true strength of Hogwarts. It was never the walls, the spells, or the enchantments. It was the belief that light could still shine in darkness, that a boy like Neville could become a warrior, that Luna, with her strange, dreamy gaze, could see through illusion, that even Draco, drowning in guilt, could be saved. They misunderstood their enemy. They thought fear would spread like fire. Instead, it sparked rebellion. One must wonder what might have been. Had Snape poisoned Dumbledore in private and returned to his role? What secrets might he have uncovered? What sabotage could he have carried out from within? How much more damage could have been dealt if Hogwarts had fallen without anyone realizing it had been breached? In choosing performance over precision, the Death Eaters exposed themselves. They turned what could have been a masterclass in subtlety into a reckless brawl. This misjudgment echoed through the rest of the war. The final year saw the castle become a battlefield. The Room of Requirement became a hideout. The Forbidden Forest became a graveyard. And the Astronomy Tower, once the place of Dumbledore's fall, would become the place of Voldemort's undoing. When Voldemort returned to Hogwarts for the final battle, he found not a broken fortress, but a stronghold of defiance. Professors, students, centaurs, house elves, they all stood against him. Even in death, Dumbledore's spirit lingered in the walls, in the spells, in the hearts of those who had once watched him fall. The Death Eaters' intervention in the school was a gamble. They had the element of surprise. They had the tools, but they lacked the restraint. The mission became a display, and in that moment they wrote their own defeat. For those who believe in military logic, the lesson is clear. Silence is more devastating than spectacle. Fear does not require noise. It festers best in uncertainty. Voldemort's regime would learn too late that theatrics do not win wars. Quiet minds, patient strategies, and hidden truths have more power than a dozen curses shouted in the dark. And Hogwarts, bloodied but unbroken, remained the symbol of that truth. The night Dumbledore died, the stars bore witness to more than just a murder. They watched the birth of a new kind of resistance, one that the Death Eaters had not foreseen. A resistance not born of vengeance but of clarity, not of rage but of purpose. And perhaps that is the true failure of evil, not that it strikes, but that it underestimates the strength of what it seeks to destroy. Number 25, Trolls in the Dungeon, the Halloween Distraction. Of all the decisions made by villains in the Harry Potter universe, few are as bafflingly reckless and absurd as Professor Quirinus Quirrell's release of a fully grown mountain troll into the dungeons of Hogwarts during the Halloween feast in Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone. At first glance, it appears to be a strategic distraction, an attempt to draw attention away from the third-floor corridor where the Philosopher's Stone lay hidden behind enchantments. But upon deeper inspection, this choice feels less like tactical brilliance and more like panicked improvisation, a dangerous spectacle that nearly killed 3 first-year students and ultimately brought far more scrutiny to the stone than it ever could have diverted. The moment the troll crashes into the narrative, chaos follows like a shadow. The children are gathered in the Great Hall celebrating Halloween with pumpkin pasties and floating jack-o'-lanterns when Professor Quirrell stumbles in, pale and trembling, and announces breathlessly, "Troll in the dungeons thought you ought to know." He then faints. The reaction is swift. Teachers leap into action. Students are herded to their dormitories and the security of the school is turned on its head. But looking at the bigger picture, what Quirrell accomplishes is less a clean diversion and more an uncontrolled disaster. Quirrell, we must remember, is not acting on his own. The soft-spoken, nervous professor is hosting to a far darker power, Lord Voldemort, clinging to the back of his head like a parasite of ambition. But even with the Dark Lord's influence whispering sinister plans into his mind, the troll plan reeks of desperation. It's the move of a man too terrified to think 3 steps ahead, opting instead for an act of violent misdirection that is more likely to draw attention than mask it. The use of a troll, a creature known for its dim-wittedness, brute strength, and complete lack of subtlety, highlights the absurdity of the decision. Trolls are notoriously difficult to control, especially once unleashed. They do not follow orders, have no understanding of friend or foe, and are as likely to flatten an ally as they are an enemy. As stated in Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them, trolls possess very little intelligence. Some have been trained for domestic use, but with limited success. Releasing such a creature in a school filled with children, under the guise of creating a distraction, borders on lunacy. More damning still is the fallout. While Quirrell may have temporarily succeeded in drawing attention away from the 3rd floor, what he truly accomplished was to incite panic and raise alarm. The professors, far from being permanently distracted, quickly dealt with the threat and immediately increased security. In fact, after the troll incident, Dumbledore and the staff began to take the protection of the Philosopher's Stone even more seriously, layering enchantments and traps that would soon prove fatal to Quirrell's future attempts. Moreover, the most ironic twist in this spectacle is that Quirrell's plan inadvertently forged one of the strongest alliances in the series, the trio of Harry Potter, Ron Weasley, and Hermione Granger. In a twist of fate, it is the troll that solidifies their friendship. Hermione, having locked herself in the bathroom after being insulted by Ron, becomes the target of the rampaging beast. Harry and Ron, instead of fleeing, go after her. In a moment of quick thinking and sheer courage, Ron manages to knock the troll out by levitating its club and bringing it crashing down on its own head. From that moment forward, as the book puts it, there are some things you can't share without ending up liking each other, and knocking out a 12-foot mountain troll is one of them. Rather than weaken Harry, the plan emboldens him. Rather than mislead the professors, it unites them in vigilance. Rather than clearing a path to the stone, it surrounds the corridor with even more protective eyes. And perhaps most importantly, it teaches Harry a vital lesson in bravery, loyalty, and the strength found in friendship, lessons he will carry into every future confrontation with Voldemort. We must also examine the psychological state of Quirrell at this juncture. He is a man unraveling under pressure. The burden of hosting Voldemort's soul, of keeping secrets under the ever-watchful eye of Dumbledore, and of executing an increasingly complex plan within the world's most magically fortified school, is driving him to extremes. The troll becomes not a tool of deception but a symbol of his deteriorating state. He can no longer trust in subtlety or subterfuge. He reverts to brute force, and it betrays him. Had Quirrell truly been clever, He might have chosen any number of quieter diversions: a fire in an unused corridor, a falsely enchanted object triggering a minor emergency, a charmed suit of armor behaving erratically. These would have drawn staff away from the third floor without risking the lives of children or rousing suspicion, but instead he released a weapon he could not control. The result is carnage and consequence. In a school as observant and tight-knit as Hogwarts, dramatic events do not go unnoticed. The troll does more than cause immediate panic. It births rumours, suspicion, and a climate of unease. The professors, far from brushing it off, begin to connect dots. Dumbledore, ever a step ahead, likely suspects that the attack is no mere accident. Severus Snape, already watching Quirrell with disdain, intensifies his surveillance. As early as the next chapter, Snape confronts Quirrell in private, his suspicion sharpened by the troll debacle. "You don't want me as your enemy, Quirrell," Snape hisses, according to Harry's recollection. The failed distraction only accelerates the unravelling of Quirrell's position. The event also has a profound emotional impact on Hermione Granger. Though her intellectual confidence remains, this brush with death shifts her priorities. She is no longer the rule-obsessed outsider. She becomes part of a trio bonded by something far stronger than academic ambition. Quirrell, in his attempt to destabilize the environment, has in fact given birth to its greatest stabilizing force. Furthermore, the scene exposes the vulnerability of Hogwarts itself. That a creature of such danger could enter the school and roam its halls without detection, even if smuggled in by a professor, raises valid questions about safety. Quirrell doesn't just endanger Harry, he makes the entire school question its own walls. The faculty is forced to re-evaluate their safeguards. Argus Filch, Minerva McGonagall, and Albus Dumbledore each respond in kind, instituting tighter measures and keeping a more watchful eye on student whereabouts. It is also worth noting that the plan backfires in yet another spectacular way. It makes Harry more curious about what's hidden on the third floor. Prior to the troll incident, Harry had overheard a brief warning about staying away from that corridor, but like any 11-year-old, he was still adjusting to the school's rhythms. After Halloween, however, and with the thrill of danger fresh in his mind, Harry becomes more intrigued than ever about the mystery of the Philosopher's Stone. Far from misdirecting his attention, Quirrell's chaos fuels Harry's determination to uncover the truth. The troll incident sets into motion a sequence of events that are entirely antithetical to Quirrell's intent. It leads to the trio discovering Fluffy, the three-headed dog. It pushes them to investigate Nicholas Flamel. It places them squarely in opposition to whatever is happening in the shadows of the castle. Quirrell may have acted to mask his intentions, but in truth he may as well have painted a target on the mystery he hoped to conceal. One must also consider the irony of Voldemort's influence in this scheme. The greatest dark wizard of all time, a master of manipulation and cunning, allows his servant to commit one of the most amateurish blunders imaginable. It suggests either desperation or arrogance, or perhaps both. Voldemort, even in his weakened state, must have known the risks. Yet he sanctioned the plan, possibly convinced of his own invincibility. If anything, this incident marks the early signs of his tendency to underestimate the very forces, love, friendship, and bravery, that would eventually destroy him. From a literary standpoint, the troll incident serves as more than a plot device. It is a catalyst. Rowling expertly uses this moment to develop character, establish alliances, and raise stakes. But from the in-universe perspective of a villain executing a covert operation, it's an unmitigated disaster. The cost of one night's distraction includes a surge in suspicion, the birth of the Heroes' Alliance, increased school security, and a new level of scrutiny from staff and students alike. Quirrell's downfall begins here, not in the final confrontation with Harry, but in the trembling announcement he delivers in the Great Hall. The moment he says troll in the dungeon, he begins his spiral toward exposure. The mask of nervous professor begins to slip. The eyes of Hogwarts begin to turn. In a strange and poetic twist, the troll, this symbol of blunt force and mindless aggression, proves the ultimate undoing of a man who placed too much faith in fear. The monster meant to serve as cover becomes a magnifying glass. What was meant to hide becomes the very thing that reveals. And so we are left with a villain whose attempt at subtlety is anything but. In choosing spectacle over stealth, Quirrell illuminates not only his flaws but the resilience of those who stand against him. A troll in the dungeon may terrify for a moment, but bravery, once awakened, cannot be silenced. Number 27, Regulus Black, a solo mission for the Horcrux. Of all the shadowy figures who once served Voldemort, none left behind a mystery as poignant and painful as Regulus Arcturus Black. A young man born into a family of pure blood supremacy, he embodied everything expected of a Slytherin heir. He was proud, cunning, ambitious, and yet, by the time of his death, he had become something far more complicated. Regulus Black turned against the Dark Lord, not for glory nor out of hatred, but for a quiet, lonely conviction that something had gone terribly wrong. It was a noble change of heart, but the way he acted on it, stealing a Horcrux alone with no backup, no escape plan, no strategy beyond raw courage, raises troubling questions about the nature of his decision. It was, by every account, a suicidal act of redemption. The story of Regulus Black does not occupy center stage in the Harry Potter series, but its shadows reach into the core of the larger narrative. According to Kreacher, the loyal and traumatized house elf, Regulus discovered the truth about Voldemort's Horcruxes and resolved to destroy them. The method was secretive. As Dumbledore later theorized, Lord Voldemort likes to operate alone, and his pride, his belief in his own superiority, ensures that he frequently underestimates others, Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince. Ironically, Regulus mirrored this solitary pride when he made his own play against the Dark Lord. In this, he became a distorted reflection of Voldemort himself, bold enough to challenge death, but too secretive to succeed. Regulus's fatal decision began when he ordered Kreacher to accompany him to the cave by the sea, where Voldemort had hidden a locket inside a basin of poison. It was a location chosen specifically to test loyalty and endurance. A trap built to ensure that only Voldemort himself could control the secrets within. Kreacher's account is chilling in its simplicity. Master Regulus told Kreacher to come back, the elf recalled in Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows. But Kreacher could only watch as Regulus drank the potion, screaming and hallucinating, weakened beyond recovery. Then Regulus, knowing the Inferi would rise, handed Kreacher the true locket and told him to leave. Kreacher obeyed. Regulus never came back. That moment, one young man alone against the tide of dark magic and death, is often romanticized as a noble sacrifice. But was it also foolish? Regulus had the advantage of knowledge. He knew the object was a Horcrux. He knew where it was hidden. He even had a willing and capable magical companion in Kreacher. But beyond that, he was unprepared. He did not test the potion in advance. He did not recruit help. He did not leave a message for his brother Sirius, who, despite their ideological differences, might have been swayed by the weight of the truth. He did not consider turning to Dumbledore, who by then was already known to be Voldemort's enemy. Instead, Regulus chose secrecy over strategy. One could argue that Regulus was forced into isolation by the very culture in which he was raised. In the noble House of Black, honor was equated with silence. Emotion was weakness, vulnerability a disgrace. To confess doubt or fear, to admit he had made a mistake in following Voldemort, would have been unthinkable for a proud, pure-blood son. But this cultural conditioning only reinforces how ill-equipped Regulus was for the mission he chose. By refusing to trust others, he sealed his own doom and possibly delayed Voldemort's defeat by years. It is a bitter irony that in trying to atone, he may have inadvertently prolonged the reign of the very evil he hoped to destroy. The tragedy of his death is made worse by how easily it might have been prevented. Dumbledore, for instance, had already begun gathering information about Voldemort's Horcruxes. He knew Tom Riddle was obsessed with objects of historical power and symbols of immortality. If Regulus had shared what he knew, the location of the cave, the nature of the locket, Dumbledore could have acted. He might have destroyed it years earlier. He might have saved Regulus's life. As it happened, Dumbledore and Harry did not reach that cave until 1996, almost 2 decades after Regulus's suicide mission. Even among the Order of the Phoenix there were members who might have understood. Sirius, for one, had abandoned the Black family's ideology. He hated his parents, but he might have listened to his brother if Regulus had reached out in time. Imagine a different world, one where 2 brothers, once torn apart by ideology, reunite in secret to destroy a piece of the Dark Lord's soul. It would not have been easy, but it would not have been impossible. They both had access to powerful magic. They both had motivation. But Sirius never even learned the truth. He died believing Regulus was just another Death Eater. That silence is perhaps the most unforgivable part of Regulus's choice. He left no notes, no instructions, no confession. Only Kreacher, a creature enslaved by generations of wizards and burdened with magical commands, knew what had happened. And because he was an elf, and because of the way the wizarding world devalued his kind, no one thought to ask him. The secrets remained buried until Harry Potter, in the final days of the Second Wizarding War, finally connected the dots. But by then it was nearly too late. The locket remained hidden for years, passing from Kreacher to Mundungus Fletcher, from Fletcher to Dolores Umbridge, and then finally into the hands of the trio. Each transfer brought suffering, fear, and corruption. It whispered to Ron. It preyed on his insecurities. The Horcrux nearly tore their friendship apart. If Regulus had succeeded, and if he had destroyed it himself, or if he had told someone how to find and destroy it, that chain of suffering might never have begun. What makes Regulus's actions so deeply human, however, is that they were both heroic and flawed. He was only 17 when he died. A teenager still living under the roof of a fanatically pure-blood family, trying to untangle himself from the web of ideology and power. In that light, his decision to act at all is astonishing. He did not have the luxury of time or guidance. What he had was conviction. The realization that Voldemort, the man he had once admired, was a monster who tortured and murdered without mercy. That was enough to turn Regulus's heart. But it was not enough to save his life. In some ways, Regulus's solo mission mirrors the myth of the lone hero, the tragic figure who enters the underworld to confront evil, only to fall before completing the task. It is a story as old as time, and one that resonates deeply. But myths are not strategies. Myths do not win wars. The wizarding world needed Regulus to live, not to die in poetic silence. His sacrifice did not defeat Voldemort. It only laid one fragile piece on the board, waiting for someone else to come along and pick it up. And that someone else, of course, was Harry. When Harry finally learns the truth about the locket, the weight of it changes him. He sees Kreacher not as a nuisance, but as a grieving servant. He begins to understand that the war is filled with invisible acts of resistance, small, private rebellions like Regulus's, buried under layers of fear and secrecy. And he realizes that heroes are not always the ones celebrated in public. Sometimes they are the ones who die alone, unnamed, misunderstood. Yet even Harry, who risked everything to destroy the Horcruxes, did not act alone. He had Hermione's brilliance, Ron's loyalty, Dumbledore's foresight, and even Kreacher's help. He relied on others. He learned to trust. And that, more than magic, was what made Harry different from Voldemort and from Regulus. Trust is the true countercurse to the Dark Lord's magic. Trust is what allowed Harry to survive and ultimately to win. The cautionary tale of Regulus Black lies not in his cowardice, for he had none, but in his pride. Pride told him that redemption required solitude, that one brave act could atone for a lifetime of complicity, that dying alone was nobler than living with the shame of asking for help. It is a mindset that has doomed many in the Harry Potter universe, from Snape's secrecy to Dumbledore's guilt. But in Regulus it is especially heartbreaking because he was so young and so close to making a real difference. Had he lived, had he confided in someone, anyone, he might have helped shorten the war. He might have stood as a witness to Voldemort's crimes. He might have redeemed the black name not just in secret but in the open, with the world watching. Instead, his only legacy was a fake locket at the bottom of a cave and a name whispered by a house elf who mourned him every day for years. It is a legacy of quiet valor but also of wasted potential. And yet in the end that lonely mission became a turning point. When Harry stood in the same cave, swallowing the same poison, he did not die. Because of Creature, because of Dumbledore, because of others. Regulus may have failed, but his intent rippled outward, creating paths for others to follow. His death was not in vain, but it could have meant so much more. Perhaps the real lesson of Regulus Black is this: even the bravest act can falter without community. Even the clearest moral compass needs allies. Voldemort was undone by the belief that only he could wield power. Regulus made the same mistake, in reverse, believing that only in dying alone could he cleanse his past. But redemption, like resistance, is strongest when shared, and if Regulus had dared to trust, to speak, to ask, to confide, the course of the war might have changed forever. Number 28, Marvolo and Morphin Gaunt, flaunting their hatred for Muggles. The small, rotting shack stood at the edge of Little Hangleton like a curse left to fester. Within its decaying walls lived the last descendants of one of the most ancient wizarding bloodlines, the Gaunts. Marvolo and his children, Morphin and Merope, were not just recluses but living relics of a diseased ideology, a family so consumed by their hatred of Muggles and obsession with blood purity that they chose destruction over dignity. Their choices, particularly those of Marvolo and Morphin, were not just morally reprehensible, but strategically disastrous. Their aggressive posturing and volatile behavior did more than isolate them. It cracked the very foundation of their legacy and helped create the conditions from which Voldemort would rise. The irony is cruel. In their blind quest to preserve the sanctity of Salazar Slytherin's blood, they ensured its ruin. Marvolo Gaunt, the patriarch, was a man drunk on lineage. His pride was not built on deeds, wisdom, or honor, but on ancestry he neither enriched nor honored. With Slytherin's ring on his finger and a locket around his neck, he clung to the past like a drowning man grasping at weeds. He wore his relics not as heirlooms but as armor, wielding them as proof of superiority in a world that had already moved on from such petty heraldry. "I'm a Parselmouth," he would snarl, as if that justified his every cruelty. But blood and language do not excuse madness. They merely provided him with delusions of authority in a home already steeped in filth and fear. His son, Morphin Gaunt, was even worse. Unhinged, erratic, and violent, he treated his magic like a weapon and his Muggle neighbors like pests. He hexed them without hesitation, laughed as they screamed, and seemed to revel in the terror he inspired. Dumbledore's memory reveals Morphin's grotesque delight in his attack on Tom Riddle Sr. "He came back, see? Snuck back, Muggle filth!" The phrase is haunting not just for its venom, but for its predictability. This was a family that hated out loud. They saw restraint as weakness and decency as treachery. They had the arrogance of kings with the manners of criminals. It was this brutal atmosphere where love was strangled by scorn and hope died in silence that shaped the fate of Merope Gaunt. She, the youngest and most tragic of the trio, was the one true thread of humanity left in that house. She was quiet, timid, and constantly abused, both physically and emotionally. Marvolo called her a squib and treated her with open contempt. Morphin hexed her for fun. In that shack, she was less a daughter and more a servant, a shadow to her family's monstrous pride. Her only rebellion was love. When she saw Tom Riddle Sr., a handsome Muggle who rode past their cottage on horseback, it wasn't lust or conquest she felt. It was longing for escape, for warmth, for anything other than what she knew. And yet even her love became corrupted. With no model for affection and no guidance, Merope did what the gaunt name had always taught. She forced her will. She bewitched Tom Riddle Sr., likely using a love potion, and dragged him into a false marriage. That act of coercion, born from desperation and learned behavior, sealed her child's fate. When she finally released Tom from the enchantment, he abandoned her. Alone and pregnant, she died in childbirth at a London orphanage, giving her son a name that was half legacy, half plea, Tom Marvolo Riddle. Had Marvolo Gaunt been a man of any sense, none of this would have happened. A wiser father might have sent his son to a proper magical institution, might have moderated his hatred, might have respected his daughter's feelings. But Marvolo had no vision beyond his own blood. He believed that hatred of Muggles was a virtue, and that violence against them was justified by heritage. He taught his children that might was right, that purity meant everything, and that the world owed them respect. In doing so, he created not heirs, but outcasts. The Ministry of Magic could not ignore them forever. When Bob Ogden, a member of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, visited the Gaunt home to serve a summons to Morphin for attacking a Muggle, he was met with disdain, aggression, and open hostility. Marvolo threatened him, Morphin attacked him, and both were arrested. The visit, detailed through Dumbledore's pensive, was a glimpse into a world rotting from the inside. "Get out of my house, you filthy little mudblood lover!" Marvolo shrieked, revealing more than just bigotry. He exposed a man who thought the law did not apply to him, but the law did apply. Marvolo was sentenced to 6 months in Azkaban and Morphin to 3. In that brief absence, the house changed. Merope, freed from their domination, made her desperate move. Her decision to enchant Tom Riddle Sr. was wrong, but it was not born of malice. It was a cry for something better. Tragically, she had never been taught how to seek love, only how to seize it. Thus, Voldemort was born not from ambition, but from a twisted chain of pain, prejudice, and poor choices. Every decision Marvolo and Morphin made, every sneer, every hex, every insult, tightened the noose around their family's future. They did not fall to an external enemy or a tragic accident. They destroyed themselves with their own dogma. The irony is impossible to ignore. The Gaunts believed they were preserving Slytherin's legacy by hating Muggles. Instead, they disgraced it. They lived in filth while clinging to relics. They had power, but used it to terrorize. They demanded respect, yet offered none. Their refusal to integrate with the magical world, their contempt for law and decency, made them pariahs. If they had simply shown restraint, if they had respected others, even slightly, they might have raised Merope in safety, given her a chance to thrive, and prevented the creation of the Dark Lord. It is here that the story becomes more than tragic. It becomes maddening, because Marvolo and Morphin were not powerless. They had magical talent, lineage, and opportunity. Morphin, despite his mental instability, had skill in Parseltongue and magical dueling. Marvolo, despite his temper, was not a fool. He could have raised his family in dignity, educated his children, and been a proud, if eccentric, member of the wizarding world. But they chose rage over reason, pride over peace. And the cost was not theirs alone. Tom Riddle Sr. was murdered by his own son, using Morphin's wand. The Muggle man, who had done nothing more than fall victim to enchantment, paid with his life. The orphanage that raised Tom Riddle bore the brunt of his growing darkness. Hogwarts became his hunting ground, and the wizarding world, which might have absorbed the Gaunts had they not spat in its face, became his battlefield. One cannot help but compare their fate to that of other pure-blood families. The Malfoys, for all their arrogance, knew how to play the political game. The Blacks had their outcasts, but also their heroes. Even the Lestranges, though fanatical, did not live in shacks cursing their neighbours. The Gaunts were different because they were loud in their hatred, foolish in their pride, and blind to consequence. And consequence came. When Morphin returned from Azkaban, he found his sister gone, his home emptier, his father dead. He lived on in isolation, broken and bitter, until his nephew returned, not to reunite, but to steal. Voldemort extracted the memory of the Riddle murder from Morphin and left him to take the blame. He confessed. He said he killed them, never recanted. And Morphin died in Azkaban, forgotten, erased, another pawn in a game he never understood. Marvolo had once boasted of his ring, of his ancestry, of his blood. But blood cannot protect against stupidity. The ring would become a Horcrux. The locket, too. The family's treasured relics meant to signify purity and pride became vessels of murder and monstrosity. What began as a desire to elevate Slytherin's legacy ended in its desecration. The Gaunts were not just a cautionary tale, they were a warning about obsession with purity, about unchecked hatred, and about the arrogance that blinds people to their own ruin. They were villains not because they had power, but because they had no purpose beyond themselves. Their failure was not just moral, it was strategic. They left behind no legacy, only ruin. And Voldemort, though far more cunning, inherited their flaw. He too believed in superiority. He too despised weakness, but unlike them, he knew how to hide it. The Gaunts shouted their hatred from the rooftops. Voldemort whispered his in the dark. But it came from the same place, from a house in Little Hangleton, where love was a weakness and cruelty a birthright. In the end, Marvolo and Morphin Gaunt made the worst possible choice a wizard can make. They declared war on the world without understanding its strength, and in doing so they did not just doom themselves, they gave birth to the greatest dark wizard of all time. Would Voldemort have been born if Merope had grown up in love, if Marvolo had been a father instead of a tyrant, if Morphin had been sent to St. Mungo's instead of being taught to curse? Perhaps not. The past cannot be rewritten, but it can be remembered. And it should be, for the sins of the Gaunts are written not just in bloodlines and tombstones, but in the scars of a war that could have been avoided if only a family had chosen compassion over contempt.